Okay, so we explored ways that maps can be bad or false or incomplete. And we have 3 slides here, 1, 2, and 3. The first factor that we isolated were the fact that we have to make certain choices, take certain decisions, semantic syntactic choice, and the design choice. That's the first step in understanding how a map can be bad, can turn out bad. When we make the semantic choice, well, there are 2 ways that a map can fail. There are incompatible features expressing compatible features, or compatible features expressing incompatible ones. And there is another factor that we call dense ordering, and that John or Katerina is going to explain.
It was your point, Katerina.
Too many incompatible classes. So dense ordering is if you have too many incompatible classes, so that then it gets confusing for the user of the map. In simple.
And then there were the design choices, where it's the choice of size, contrast, the legibility of the map, and well, there are also the effects of disorientation on the user, for example, and other practical matters. These choices were indexed then to purposes or uses of the map. We suggested 4 uses: navigation, observation, information, and making inferences. Navigation can be understood in 2 ways. There is finding something or avoiding something. So the use of the map is to find the individual or the kind, or to avoid the individual or the kind. In the case of observation, we have the occasion to examine the spatial structure of an area or the temporal indexicality, for example, something that happened in the past or a prediction concerning the future. There is also information that may go wrong. There's too much information or too little information. And making inferences, correlations, or planning or predicting. Someone mapping one day or whatever, on occasion of plan. Finally, we isolated the last factors after the choice and the purposes. We have to take account of the audience, so for whom is the map addressed, to whom is the map addressed, and the background knowledge required. And again, these are 2 ways. These determine 2 ways that a map can go bad. Any questions?
Yes. So, last point. So they determine 2 ways in which the map can go bad without being false, or by virtue of being false. So suppose my audience is, I don't know, tourists from Wyoming who are used to live in a fairly simple geometrical world. I can draw a bad map for them because my map is too sophisticated, so to speak, for someone coming from Wyoming. Straight roads and stuff. This is really an intricate thing. Would that be a bad map for them, but of course still true, right? Is that the idea?
The idea behind the background knowledge is an audience. Things can be bad for an audience if you give them too much, if you give them too little. I mean, Katerina,
No,
your
the
point
idea
was
is that if your map, who is the targeted audience? Is it the general population that aims to find their way around Paris, for instance? Or is it a group of professionals that are seeking specific information, and maybe also they are kind of experts in reading maps? So these sorts of
so this is really Gricean conversational accuracy, right? State your message, as it were, in the way that's most appropriate for your interlocutor, your audience.
And their purposes and so holistically. So it's not a case of map being false or true. So
It would grow out of the design choices, perhaps.
Right.
And the semantic
and the
syntactic choices,
the
but there are,
semantic choices
you
as
know,
well.
the syntax and semantics are what the representation brings to the
Yes.
context.
Yes.
But the Gricean mechanisms are the things that are going to work with what it
Mhm.
brings
Yeah.
to the context.
Well, the design choices belong to, we talked about pre-semantics the other day. So to the pre-semantical level, I mean, so identify the right, in fact, identify the relevant properties of the map. Relevant for, I mean, interpreting the map.
Yeah, I mean, audiences have to figure out what the map is
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah.
It's true. Someone brought up an issue about, I forgot who it was in the group, who brought up an issue about having a good legend, you know, for the map and things like that. But there are these interesting, I think it is an interesting fact that pictures and maps are more open to pre-semantic worries than linguistic representations are. We usually know what language we're speaking. We often don't know, as it were, what language a map was written in.
I have another question about point 2. So those 4 main kinds of purpose, navigation, observing, information, and inference, they look very interesting. My question is simply, did you consider other possible purposes and eventually rule them out, or these are the only ones that you discussed? I'm interested in whether there are other candidates that get knocked out.
We regarded inferences as like the wastebasket category that would include everything else that we wanted. We said we weren't sure. So we didn't actually come up with, we didn't come up with a ton of uses for maps actually.
No, we came up with some, but then we thought it better to have general categories rather than.
The one thing that
Yeah.
well, the one thing that I thought was interesting is that I think the spatial stuff is very interesting, but the way in which maps work temporally is also
It is,
very
yeah.
interesting. So
Yeah,
there's a
yeah.
question as to whether we treat maps here and now as
Yeah.
being here and now representing maps or not. And you know, I know that Roberto has these things on us being located within a map spatially, but we also want to locate the map temporally very often. And there's a question as to whether that plays in with your Borgesian stuff actually, because the map is here and now. And we use maps from different time periods, but having a sense of that is important actually for lots of goals like predictions, other things like that. But when I'm using a map for navigation, it's not just I locate myself on it, I locate it here, and now it has to, and that's not a representational element in a way. It's not an
And also this governs the temporal connectedness or indexicality, whether, so a map from Paris a few thousand years ago, probably now it's not, I mean it's not a good map now. But it may be good for some purposes, because if you want to do some excavation, let's say, it's useful for that purpose.
That's true.
So, yeah, they are tied. I mean, this is an interesting part for me, that they are tied, they are connected to temporal.
So what is the difference between observing and information? What's the...
I don't think we actually really were going to put those as separate. I think information was a thing we wrote on the board that it wasn't clear what the purpose,
Well, information could be, for example, about the weather or about population, which
Yeah.
really isn't spatial or temporal,
okay.
right? I thought you might something
Oh, I was thinking that would be spatial probably and temporal,
Yeah.
the weather. So I was thinking of information as like we were listing kinds of information a map might
Yeah.
give us, but then what would we do with that information? So sometimes.
No, and we also mentioned that too much information may be a vice for a map, and also too little information may be a vice for a map. But that would depend also on the purposes for which a map
That's
is
kind of
made.
the yeah.
Yeah.
that would be some more
Yeah.
So it's also the amount of information.
So I have a question. At some point, I think Achille or Roberto showed the map of the Earth, and I think the Bering, Détroit de Bering, so the Bering Strait
Yeah.
was occurring twice in the
Yeah,
in the
what's
map.
Yeah.
So that's a violation of some of the principles implicit here.
Mhm.
Is it a bad map?
Yeah, I don't know. Good question.
Well, it's meant to convey relevant
Yes,
information,
the-
though, namely that,
Yeah.
and then you're back here, right? So don't think that these 2 points are very distant from one another because they are at opposite sides of the map. In fact, they're very close to each other because the map is circular. So I show you the beginning of this again to stress that. So obviously it's it's a good thing to do, but technically is it a redundant?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question.
But it shows the correlation. On one side, it shows the relation of Bering Strait to Eurasia, and the other side to North America. So if the
Right.
map's purpose is to teach students that relationship, then it's not bad.
Yeah, it's not redundant. It says different things in each case,
Yeah.
or it serves a different
So that would
purpose.
be in the inference type category.
Correct, yeah.
Can I ask, can you say again how indexicality appears under observing? What did you say about indexicality in that category? As distinct
As
from
opposed to navigation.
navigation, yes.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure we need indexicality there as opposed to in the under the navigational head, John. I mean, I don't know. So I think it's most salient in the navigational case,
Okay.
but other people might do. There are other people in our group. Where did everybody go? How do you?
Or it can give you it can give you observational information. So there is a lake here, for instance, that you would observe if you were in Paris. So, but this depends on the time. Yeah. So now.
There's a lake. You look at the map. You say there's a lake here.
Mhm.
That's the indexical feature.
But there is a lake here, but this is connected to the now. So when the map was made, there was a lake there, but I don't know, 100
okay.
years passed. There is
Okay,
no
so-
lake because so you
it's
wouldn't be able to
temporary,
observe a
then.
lake where you
Yeah,
took
yeah,
walk.
it's
Okay, I see.
temporary.
Yeah. So
Okay. I thought you were sort of saying that if I see a lake on a map here, it means that the lake is here. And I was going to try to sort of accuse you of saying something silly.
Did we want to say anything about absence of intuition?
Yeah.
You do?
No, I thought we
No, I mean, just because we mentioned it briefly, but
Oh, the absence intuition.
that is an absence. Maybe absences are most important in the inference seeking correlations, where it's more
Oh, yes.
important than simply
Right.
intuition. So if somebody were doing AI with millions of maps,
Yeah.
it would be important that the accuracy of what's not there, that's totally part of the analysis.
Yeah. Correlations are hard to do without respecting absence. Right. The absence intuition did not. It's the absence intuition because it's a kind of technical sort of thing. We didn't make that the centerpiece. We made it the kind of thing that we'd like to emerge from a consideration of what could make things semantically and syntactically bad, what could be the bad design choices, and then vis-a-vis our purposes, what might look bad. And you can try to extract absence from this, I think.
From the absence of the.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's not there. It's the one thing I can say about absence.
So he wrote the following. This is the map of the Soviet map of 1525, where the previous map full continents were sort of packed. There was no empty space in it. At this point, islands and was full of continent islands and little representation. The Soviet map is mostly empty. The eye wanders south along the American coastline until it peters into emptiness. Anyone looking at the map and possessing even minimal curiosity is tempted to ask, what beyond this point? The map gives no answer. It invites the observer to set sail and find out. Remember, it's a beautiful metaphor of these empty spaces acting like magnets on explorers.
And it's only the navigable parts of the world which are cartographed.
Yes, it's. But don't know what it is here. I mean, is it navigable or not? They just come down to inform.
Notice,
mais
however,
à ce
that
moment-là,
there is a
tu
difference
t'essayes là-bas
between,
maintenant.
Roberto, between this
Avec
empty
EHESS,
space and this. Here they know exactly that there is not, but for that matter here, the Mediterranean. So the notion of empty space here is actually ambiguous. Unless you, suppose you color in blue the known portions of water and leave the rest white, then it would be more. Otherwise it's ambiguous. But it's a very interesting point.
For such a large scale map, it's incredibly accurate, the shapes and
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, considering you have to do that just by sailing around the coast.
Amazing.
Here.
Amazing.
Also, is the rectangle is the size almost of maps today, as it's almost they knew that this must be
It
more or
doesn't
less
continue,
how long it
yeah.
goes.
That's true.
Yeah.
Smart people.
Maybe they did some trigonometry or something
Yeah.
on the circle. So I think actually I will start directly with the 4GX. So all of our discussion actually starts with this idea by Borges about the map that's one-on-one and superimposed. So I'll read the starting quote. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of the city, and the map of the empire, the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that that vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness was it that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winter. In the deserts of the west, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. So this is from 1954, from on exactitude in science. So this is like the point of departure of our discussion. And we're thinking of maps that had the two following characteristics: that they were one-on-one and that they were superimposed. So not a different room in some other building that is a one-on-one map of this room, but superimposed on the room. And we discussed about what this meant and possible uses of this. And we thought of examples that were actual examples. So one of them is drawings of pipes below the floor. This is something that people go and draw, for example, with chalk, where the pipes are. So, and this is useful for if you are a plumber or if you have to do some construction work. And another example that Valeria brought up is constructional drawings, as if where to cut the lines, as it were, for example. And this is an example that she wrote from the encyclopedia from Marina. I will show you some pictures later, which are quite good. And another example is augmented reality, in which you could have a tablet that tells you what different things are, or what different spaces are.
With another example, or maybe you're coming with.
Well, this is the pipes. Yes. So
Would another example be those places such as the city of Varzi, which we discussed actually a few days ago, where the border between the Netherlands and Belgium is so messy that they actually draw it on the ground.
Yeah.
That would be a case of.
Yeah, that's a good example as well. Yeah. That will be. I think that will be where the same. Yeah.
But then any sign that says "Welcome to Paris" or the border signs are in a way bits of a one Borges map.
Yes, they are. I mean, it depends. Well, they are points. So I mean, if they don't say something more like this point belongs to the line that is the border. I mean, they're implying that this is the border, but it's not the same as drawing a line on the floor, right? Because when you cross and it says like "Welcome to France," there's no line. There's just like somewhere around here is the.
What about the wall that Trump this building between Canada, between Mexico.
It's coming.
It's coming also there, but right now it's
The Canadians were building.
Mexico and the United States. That'd be the portion of a Borges map. Here ends the.
Well, I guess
States.
the
Well,
question
whatever,
for the
just
It's,
do it.
it's interesting.
It's
Sorry,
interesting, yeah,
there are.
it could be, I mean, in a way, like the entrance to this building is also the map. You could think that this is the map to where the building begins. Yeah.
Maybe another example I just thought quite close to this one is sometimes you have here was the limit to the Bastille, around the Bastille.
Yeah, that's a very good
That's
one.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, the feet.
Here was the Bièvre in the
Yes. And there's the Berlin's wall.
Yeah, this wall is like that as well. Yeah.
And the roof.
It's yeah, that's interesting that we didn't have as a characteristic or requirement that is a present, that it is present. We kind of assume that it is, but it's not necessarily. And this is the example, I couldn't find it with very high definition from the encyclopedia. So this is someone who is drawing the line on the rock where you have to cut the rock. So it's like kind of making a map of the rock on the rock, as it were.
Is the key feature of for it to be a Borgesian map that it has to be one-to-one?
Yes.
Or is it just the superposition?
Both.
It has to be
Both.
both superimposed
It has to be-
and one-to-one.
It has to be both, yeah.
Because there are a lot of superimposed maps. In a sense, all orientation,
Yeah,
all uses
exactly.
of orientation are superimposed.
Yeah, and a GPS. That's what we're thinking also. A GPS, for example, is superimposed. And then, for example, if you zoom GPS a lot, maybe it will become a Borgesian map in your phone because it will be one-on-one and superimposed. If you really zoom until it's one-on-one. And interestingly, you could zoom into things more than one-on-one. There's no limitation. You could have a map that's bigger than the actual in a screen. You could have one,
And
but it wouldn't become superimposed anymore.
the one-to-one map that's not superimposed would be the Carolian map from Lewis Carroll, where it's an object in a way that they cannot.
Yeah, there is a historical point we're making if you go back to the quotations.
Yes.
There is a distinction between Carolian maps, because they are never superimposed. Actually, they objected to superimposing it, because it would hide the sun, farmers objecting, so it never gets superimposed. And then they use the country itself as its own map. Tricky, but it's not a Borgesian map. So Borgesian map is when you take the map and superimpose it.
But when it says, so we now use the country itself as its own map, I think the point is that you're, of course, rejecting, is that a 1-1 map would be actually damaging to the farmers and so on, but useless. Just use the, if it's 1-1, just use the real thing. What's the point of duplicating it if it is 1-1?
Yeah.
Because
Which of course you can reject.
You can reject because you can have information
Right,
which
exactly.
is not in reality.
But
and you want to-
that's the reason why he says that, not that the country itself is in fact its own map, but rather that for those who want to have a 1-to-1 map, why not just use the country itself? I take it that that's the point of that.
Yeah, that's what Carlos said, and they also.
I
say
assure
at
he
some
does
point-
nearly as well, you see.
But even Borges at some point says that, eventually people that came after the geographers thought that the vast map was useless, or even so that the vast map was useless. So it even implies that's evident.
But then you have the other. I mean, then all maps can be used as Borgesian maps, of course. So all maps can be used as reflexive maps of themselves. No? Any map.
A map becomes a Borgesian map of itself.
Yeah.
But maybe the relationship, the one-to-one relationship is always with reality.
Physical.
Well, but the map is real.
Map is a real.
It's a real object. Yeah.
Well, it's only
Yeah.
an abstraction of.
To use a map as a map of itself, you'd have to reinterpret it
Yeah.
in a major way. So
Because you don't have all
the
stuff.
colors on the map have to stand for different things now. Right? So the color on a map stands for a color on another map, as opposed to a kind of building or a street or whatever. So you can generate Borgesian maps out of a map.
Yeah, but it's not
But
the,
it would be,
the
even though it would
intended.
look very similar, it would be semantically and syntactically rather different.
It could also be simpler. You could have a very complex map, and then you have a Borgesian map that's simpler. That's on top.
Oh, yeah, of course. You can choose what you want to map.
You can selective Borgesian maps and just for spatial information.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what we thought.
Yeah, so
We're
that's,
thinking in those terms.
yeah, that actually becomes quite useful. And yeah, we were thinking a lot of superimposed and what it meant superimposed, and we thought about the idea that your position generates a red dot. So wherever you are, it's the kind of red dot point of you are here. So wherever you are automatically becomes the you are here point in the map. And then we were thinking about possible counterexamples. We thought maybe someone with a very, very impossibly long leg in the long neck in the beginning that's looking down and where that will work. And then we came to the idea of rather than having a map that's on top, superimposed could also mean just at a much higher level, and you could have a kind of very tall ceiling that's a mirror map of the floor, of the bottom, and then that will still count within as a Borgesian map, and it will also be more useful because then you could actually look at more in perspective at the map. But it will probably still be that wherever you are is you are here in the map. Just vertically, you'll need to project yourself vertically, and there you are. And then we thought also that they are egocentric. That they always start. They are like those London maps that are egocentric, but instantly, just as they are instantly red point of you are here is generated, they instantly turn as you turn. And Valeria also highlighted that this is like many ancient maps, and she told us about the tabula Peutingeriana, which is this map, which is for the way of going back to Rome. So Italy and Africa and Sicily, they are all turned and projected in such a way that it's egocentric for the way for going to Rome from the east.
It's very long actually, you don't get it.
Ah yeah, you
It's like
unroll it.
something that you have to unscroll.
Yeah. And then we thought what would be a non-visual version of a Borgesian map. And we started talking that the talking objects could be a kind of like auditory Borgesian map, something that maybe an app or something, or maybe objects that directly talk, so that when you approach a table, then it says something like I am a table, or this is a table, or this is the EHESS, or you are like this many meters from the door, this is the -1 floor, different things, or this is an old book. And then we thought that even more you could have like a kind of life geography, biographer. Someone who follows you around and describes everything you are doing all the time. And obviously, they describe different aspects. You could have someone who describes what you are saying, someone who describes the way you are moving, and you could have it in a second person, third person, and many other ways.
That's superimposition.
And it is superimposition as well. It's like
it reminds me of a Godard, film by Godard.
Yeah, we thought that it's a lot like it's also a lot like a GoPro. Yeah, like one that follows it. And it's a lot of things that are happening now with live broadcasting and GoPros, and they become a bit like
that's visual.
Live. Yeah. Well, that one is visual actually. It started as a conversation, and then we thought that the live biography would be a lot like a GoPro version.
Did you spot the difference between the two biographies?
Did you spot the difference in terms of I couldn't pay attention to both.
Yeah, it's hard to pay attention.
If you do something, we can start.
It's very hard for me actually to pay attention to to myself, to what I'm saying.
You are
Pablo is
precisely
standing in
what
the
you
room.
Yeah, and I'm trying to.
Moving his hand.
But what about the simple case of, say, a soccer game or a baseball game that you're listening on the radio? Is that?
Yeah, will
Is
that be?
that,
So you're not paying attention to the subtle difference between the two. Maybe
Well-
you should do them in different time, at different time, not the same time.
Yeah.
Perspectival?
Well, you're asking a question about the commentary, run-on commentary. You would say about
Do I just
Achille,
talk so
that's
that you
the
can do it?
question about
Do I just keep talking so that
Yeah, maybe.
it becomes more and more complicated? Well, yeah, that's the question. That whether a lot of things that are just like live recording
you are wondering and
become
asking different questions.
become a kind of Borgesian map.
So he,
Yeah, but
you,
Yeah.
That's-
Yeah.
So it's like
So
a
this
there's
is,
another-
this is a red dot representation, and that could be, I mean, she could be talking about someone else in some other place,
yeah.
doing this thing at another time.
Yeah, so maybe it's more Borgesian, which is more.
So the soccer thing is interesting because
Well, it would be weird if, like, for example, Cristiano Ronaldo was running while he was playing football with a kind of. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess in soccer maybe. No, you mean football, soccer, right?
Yeah,
So like maybe he runs around and someone is telling him what's happening to Cristiano Ronaldo as he like plays. That would be
you're
like,
so good, so nice.
Yeah. He probably does. I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah.
That's me, that's me.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he did that. Yeah.
would that be a, I mean,
No,
it's got
the
the
word is-
temporal connection, but it doesn't have the right sort of, I don't know, it's a little bit
It
weird.
becomes,
because I don't know
more
what
clear with the talking objects, right? And then the moment if someone following you.
What about three transcending?
We talked about
Yeah,
it.
We talked about it, right?
At least you prove that some maps have propositional contents.
And just to emphasize the differences also, Valeria was describing, and I was more commenting or describing the content. And it's interesting that for a sports commentary, because you could describe the actions, and you could describe how well the action is realized, or how well
The team is playing.
Yeah,
It's
with a good
state
commentator.
description.
Yeah, and you're not missing much of anything, but if it's
More than-
football or basketball.
More than one-to-one scale.
Yeah.
The map is bigger than that.
Yeah, that's right,
It's
exactly.
even more so for
Yeah.
cricket.
Yeah.
Exactly, in terms of baseball. In baseball, the archive is very important because you use the stats, right?
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. That tells you everything that happened in the game, actually.
Yeah.
The box score, we say. Yeah.
Box scores.
Yeah.
You had a question.
Yeah, I was
That's my
thinking of
baseball cards.
a lower level version of talking object and map teaches the crossing, pedestrian crossing, there is something for the blind people that say, here is the crossing, you are at the crossing of two streets and the light is red.
We had this example too. So talking objects.
Yeah. This one.
There's a particular, she's saying just it's particular to blind people that this is a thing that might exist already. Does it exist already?
At everything you have the
In-
white, white
Crossings, some crossings.
Audio description.
I know it exists now with
This one is
museums like
placed here
audio guide service
to
like
be
that.
touched by people.
But are these really maps? So you've got
Mm,
kind of
no.
online information, but
I don't think we agreed completely on this. This was just like
They
one of the
do
parts
the
of the
same, so
discussion.
they share two features, the two features of the Borgesian map in that they're one-to-one.
Yeah.
So the time of the representation is the time represented, and they're representing now, so they're mapped exactly onto the times that they're representing.
but can there be false Borgesian maps? Because of course you might have false
Yeah.
description of what what's
You
coming.
could have something like this is a refrigerator, I guess.
Or something which is displaced
Yeah.
5 meters to the left.
Okay, I have two questions. One is very quick. Suppose I'm filming what's happening in this room, and the screen that I have on my camera, so to speak, is just as large, well, in some relevant sense, one-to-one. Of course, it's two-dimensional as opposed to three-dimensional, but it's one-to-one. Then what you see on the screen and what's happening in the room are in a way connected Borges-like, even though one is two-dimensional and the other is three-dimensional. Something like that.
Well, that's interesting thing that if you were not in the room, then that wouldn't superimposed anymore. That will be more like a map of this room in some other place. That's one on one. I think I'm
Well,
with
you
you.
can be
It seems to be more like a projection.
It could be, yeah.
But as long as you are in, yeah.
It seems to be more like a projection.
It is probably a projection, yeah, but
I wonder whether scale works differently with pictures, right? So, you know, pictures are these projective things. There's a way in which it maps right onto the scene. I mean, because remember, pictures aren't, we don't care about scale in pictures, right? So the 1-1 is a 1-1 of a sort of abstract two-dimensional space, which actually is doesn't have a size, right? It's a two-dimensional space that, you know, I don't know about. I think there's a matching, but it's not clear that there's a problem. I mean, it almost looks more Borgesian than a regular map would be, because the map actually works differently.
good. So here's the second question then, and it's a paradox for Borgesian maps. So before they actually ended up doing the one-to-one map, they were making maps that were a bit smaller. So a map of the empire was the size of the region, a map of the region was the size of the city. Now, suppose that so there's another famous writing by Borges, Partial Enchantments of the Quixote, where he discusses the paradox. It goes like this. Josiah Royce, in the first volume of his work, The World and the Individual, has formulated the following paradox. Let us imagine that a portion of the soil of England has been leveled off perfectly, and that on it a cartographer traces a map of England. The job is perfect. There is no detail of the soil of England, no matter how minute, that is not registered on the map. Everything has there its correspondence. This map, in such a case, should contain a map of the map, which should contain a map of the map of the map, and so on to infinity, etc., etc. Now, that's what happens if your smaller map, despite not being one-to-one, contains all the relevant information, which, as we know, is perfectly possible. You know, there are many points in this line as there are points in this line. There's one correspondence. So I can have a map of this size, a map of this size, a map of this size, which are in fact perfectly in one-to-one correspondence with every point in the world, right? So a smaller map can be paradoxical, yeah, sort of, in this sense, because it goes on and on forever in self-reproducing the map itself, the map. Now, in the case where you have a one-to-one map, in the case that you've been discussing, in a way you still have the same problem, because the map is part of the world. It's part of the empire. So the map should be representing itself as well. And so it becomes a map of the world, which contains the map of the world, which contains the map of the world, and so on and so forth. So the question is it really possible to have such a one-to-one map if the map is part of the world?
The maps don't have to represent everything in the world.
No, but this one, the Borges map, has absolutely everything, right? It says point by point. How was it here? That the map was the size of the empire, coinciding point for point with it. Now the map itself is part of the empire.
Yeah, but you know, I can represent this point, but I don't have to represent every feature instantiated at the point. So I don't have to represent the feature, there's a map at this point.
Yes, and I think we listed this kind of things as under the category of distractions.
I knew you would be
No, but it's
dismissing my question.
Totally, completely. I allow myself to do that. It's a mathematician's idea about mapping.
It's a self-reference puzzle like every other. And
Okay,
it's legitimate if you want it to be a map of everything. I think this reply might take care of it. But I'm still...
you're still willing to push the mathematician's idea that if you nest it, it's going to nest it infinitely and so blocking.
Well, point by point.
No, I think we have to move to the next presentation because.
I'm really sorry, I have to go.
What time was it? 6?
6 for Yannick. But he also has a slot at 6:40, so if you're
No,
late.
6 is fine. I will cancel.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So, John, you will be seeing.
Yes.
Hold on a second. There we go.
That's fine, like
Nope, it works better. So. Okay.
Okay, so I guess our starting point is this objection that Bloomson formulates against Casati and Varzi in 1999, the familiar paper, in which he tries to argue that maps cannot be compositional because if they were, our understanding of them would require mastery of an unlimited number of simple expressions or simple representations and specifically referential expressions. The idea here is that for any map you can divide up the space of that the map occupies into regions in different ways, in an infinite number of different ways. Each one corresponds to, I guess, at least one region of space. And in that case, in order to understand any number of maps, you would have to understand any number of, let's say, constants or proper names, or something like that. So we'll deal with that a little later, but first we wanted to, under 2, but first we just wanted to set out a few points which seems to us true and which together seem to lead to this idea that maps are compositional and therefore to Bloomson's objection to the idea that maps are compositional. So the starting point for us is the idea that maps are representations and that as representations the relevant dimension for their evaluation is truth. So, for example, one way to try to formulate that is under baseline there, the third sentence. To understand a map is to know its truth conditions, which is to say how the word is supposed to be for the map to be true. So it does seem to make sense to describe maps in this way as valuable for their truth. And of course, once you say truth, you seem to be implying that they're complex representations or structured representations. And then the question is, how do you explain how we understand them and how do we assign truth conditions to the representations? And also here we had Jérôme reminded us that Ramsey describes truth conditions as success conditions, and if that is true, then it's very useful because it sort of allows us to join the idea that a map can be true with the idea that it can be used. We also, at the end there under baseline, we've just added, no, not the end, the second paragraph, we've just mentioned that there seem to be other theories of interpretation or other theories of meaning for representations which do not assume that we have that representations which are capable of truth are compositional or are understood because we master a finite base of simple expressions plus a certain set number of rules of combination. For example, when a map just shows you how to get from your location to another location by tracing a line, for example, and you try to follow the line or you use some orientation mechanism like a compass, it doesn't seem that you're necessarily using any kind of recursive compositional system to understand the map. You're just following the line. So that's just to say that people could be successfully using maps without that necessarily showing that they're using some kind of recursive compositional system to interpret maps as representations, as would be suggested if one applied Davidsonian theory of interpretation and meaning to maps, in the way, for example, Blumson seems to want to do when he formulates the objection against Casati and Varzi. So, I've already said what Blumson's objection is. Achille mentioned it at the end of his talk very briefly. So the idea is that a system of compositional representations is supposed to function as follows. For any representation, you can split it up syntactically into recognizable, repeatable parts. You know those parts because there's only a finite number of them to master. You know the rules of composition, so you can split each new syntagm, each new representation, into familiar parts under known rules of combination, and that allows you to give an interpretation or to assign content to that representation. And Blumson's objection is that you, for the reasons I explained earlier, that you would have to master an infinite number of names. Now, our first, I guess, objection to that is that languages, when you master a language, you're constantly encountering sentences containing names whose reference you don't know. And nonetheless, you can make sense of the sentence. And also, as Achille mentioned, numbers. You seem to be able to use numbers in the framework of natural language sentences, for example. But of course, numbers are infinite in number, and you don't have to master each number to be able to do that. Now, as we were thinking about that, we tried also to figure out how it is that we understand sentences containing names with whose reference we are not familiar. And one mechanism, obviously, is a quantificational mechanism, something like if you say, let me think of a name that people wouldn't know, Xiropaidis. That's a Greek name. Xiropaidis runs. Well, what do you do? I mean, basically some X runs, and then you have some very naturally, apparently, ability to think X equals A, some constant referring to something. You can have thoughts like that, and you can say, well, I'm just going to postpone the question of knowing what the semantic value of the constant of Xiropaidis is, but in any case, it means that something runs, and I can assign some particular value to it. It seems that something like that is going on very often when you understand sentences which contain constants whose semantic value you're not familiar with. And it seems to us that perhaps something similar is going on. That takes us to our second and main reply to Blumson. It seems to us that something very similar to that may be going on when we interpret maps, and for that matter, maybe some pictures, very often pictures as well. Namely, parts of the picture refer to regions. So, for example, a colored part of the picture of the map refers to some region. Even if you didn't know what the region was, for example, because you didn't know what part of the world the map represented, somehow you understand what there's some kind of existential claim in the map here. I hope I'm not adding too much into what we said earlier. This is just my way of understanding it. So Jérôme and I can't remember your name, and Achille, if I'm sort of not faithfully saying what we said, just correct me, okay? So it seems that maybe we can understand, at least in one sense, maps as making some kind of existential claim. There is a region of space which has the property of being, say, forested or being occupied by water. And from there on, it seems that we need some further information to secure reference. and the reference might be secured because you look, you zoom out, or you look at the title of the map, and the map says map of such a region of Borneo, or some place that you're not, shapes you're not familiar with. Okay. So that seems to be one way to figure out what the referent is of a map without having to master a proper name for each possible way of cutting up regions of the world. Generally, it seems to us, and this is sort of our main point against Bloomson, that instead of having to learn not necessarily even an infinite, but a really vast vocabulary of symbols in order to understand maps, perhaps we could be doing something else. Perhaps our spatial, our ability to reason spatially, or perhaps even our ability to, the fact that spatial relations are built into perception, perhaps allow us to figure out or to assign values to regions of maps without having to have prior knowledge of which region of the map of which region of the world each region of the map corresponds to. So in other words, it's a spatial system of reference which allows us, using our spatial and topological intuitions or abilities, to assign values even if we have not previously learnt a vocabulary of symbols. And if that's the case, obviously it probably means that maps and pictures may be structured representations or compositional representations without that meaning that we can split them up as syntagms into simpler syntagms with which we are familiar in advance each time. So we ended up with this thought. In other words, some kind of spatial competence or ability to reason spatially, to manipulate part-whole relations in perception, seems to stand in for the acquisition of a vocabulary of symbols, without compromising the status of maps as structured representations. So that's the essence, I think, of our proposal for replying to Bloomson's learnability of it. So I think we'd agree that Bloomson's, as it stands, Bloomson's objection has something interesting to say. It allows us to clarify what exactly is meant by saying that maps are compositional or are structured representations, and maybe forces us to acknowledge or explain the role of spatial reasoning or mereological reasoning or perception simply in understanding maps. Now, a last point, which is 3 here. There's a sort of objection that Achille raised himself at lunchtime against the 99 paper, was that perhaps maps are propositional in some derivative sense. In other words, you look at a map, or you look at, for that matter, the scene around you, and you can describe it verbally, and you can produce all kinds of sentences, and the sentences are structured and are compositional, but that doesn't mean that the scene itself is structured or compositional. So in the same way, maybe maps are not themselves structured syntactically or compositional, but nonetheless we can give descriptions of their contents in compositional representational format. And here we sort of formulated a dilemma. We thought that it depends what you think of as the truth makers of representations. And if the truth makers of representations are simple things like things and events, and that applies to sentences as well, and the same problem should emerge for sentences. So that puts maps and sentences on a par, and we have the same problem to solve for language. On the other hand, if you think, as Armstrong, or apparently Wittgenstein, I didn't know this, that the truth maker of a sentence requires you to posit a specific relation, an exemplification relation holding between universals and particulars, between the object and the property instantiated. In that case, if you're positing exemplification as part of your truth makers, you're going to need them for language as well as for maps and pictures. So, for example, you can say that maps or pictures are simply pictures of objects, but that still is not going to allow you to explain their accuracy or truth conditions or how they have any form of veridicality. And if you want to explain what form of veridicality they have, you're going to have to introduce an exemplification relation to make them capable of being true or veridical. So I guess here our replies were just to shift the problem onto the truth maker, onto what makes representations true, and to sort of say that what applies to pictures will apply to languages as well. So that was our brief sort of excursus into issues of compositionality, propositionality,
are you anticipating a reaction by
and learnability? Sorry.
Are you anticipating a reaction by Bloomsbury to this structured spatial? Because I mean, why didn't he think of it himself?
Because, okay, so we're granting the broadly Davidsonian picture that we mentioned at the beginning, right? So that compositionality is necessary for learnability. And responding to that, the idea that John explained earlier is that in the case of maps, compositionality is essential for learnability, but it's not sufficient. And indeed, the additional ingredient is the fact that maps are spatial languages, unlike, say, English. They're spatial objects, and therefore we can rely on our spatial competence to explain the missing part of learnability. Now, with respect to that, I think the reply of someone like Bloomson can only be to deny that this spatial competence is only an additional necessary ingredient, but such that together with compositionality they're sufficient for explaining learnability. Of course, one can work on that. I don't think we didn't have time, of course, to work on more detail. But the general consensus among us was that this is clearly something important. Languages such as English depend entirely on compositionality. You have to know the vocabulary and you have to know the grammar. Once you know the vocabulary and the grammar, you're supposed to have the competence that is necessary and sufficient to understand every sentence, on the understanding that to understand a sentence is to understand its truth conditions, how the word should be in order for it to be true. But there is no guarantee that the same is true of every language. In particular, our thought is that spatial languages such as maps or perhaps pictures, although they require compositionality, they also benefit from the fact that there is a spatial competence which can certainly intervene when it comes to dealing with infinitely many bits and pieces. So we don't have to learn all the vocabulary, as it were, because otherwise we cannot, get the grammar going, etc. Because partial knowledge of the vocabulary together with spatial competence might just be sufficient.
Can I ask about this?
Yeah.
Because I thought I never found Ben's objection very compelling. So so let's, you folks think that the locations are names. They work like proper names.
That's Bloomson's idea.
And it's Bloom's idea, which he gets from these two. But you don't think they work like, it's not like this one's Ben, this one's Harriet, this one, it's not like that, right? Because you actually have this strong constraint, topological constraint on the way the names work, right? So there might be some problem linking this up with a specific region of space. But from a comprehensibility standpoint, the idea is supposed to be their proper names, so they don't work descriptively. So it's not in virtue of representing this point between this and that it refers to that point. It's actually just a proper name, but they have a structure. So from the understanding standpoint, I guess, wouldn't you just lean on what you call spatial competence here, is that just, in effect, leaning on the fact that you can take one of these names, fix it, and then everything else has to follow?
In a way, yes.
Okay.
So in fact, when we were in our room, we were discussing the formal model that Roberto described very briefly this morning for maps, for formal maps. A domain plus an interpretation function, F, which assigns to colors, say to predicates, properties, and to regions, map regions, corresponding regions from the world. Now, the point is precisely that, forget about interpreting predicates, we're talking about proper names here, so the map regions. The F function, the interpretation function, isn't really just like direct reference, i.e. arbitrary.
It can't be a purely extensional set of lists.
Well, in a way, it can still be extensional, but it does get, maybe I can concede the point, yeah, it gets sort of intentional in the following sense. F is constrained. The reference of the map regions isn't arbitrary, like the reference of John, Bill, and Peter, because although it is a function assigning a reference to a name, it is constrained by the myriotopological organization of these names, because maps are spatial languages. So in a way, yes, it's sort of descriptive in the sense that it's a descriptive theory of names in the sense that the interpretation function is constrained descriptively, and the relevant amount of description, however, is just myriotopological, and that comes with our spatial competence generally. So you're right, in this sense it goes beyond the simple theory. To every map region there is a corresponding world region. It must, in other words, a lot of work is done here by what this morning I call the mirroring principle. That this language, this spatial language, the map, is in some important sense isomorphic to the world that it represents. No such thing is present, of course, in ordinary languages such as English. I mean, in a way you can think of Wittgenstein's picture theory as being based on a mirroring principle of this sort, or maybe the medieval so-called speculative grammarians who were called speculative, not because they speculated on grammar, but because they thought language is a speculum, a mirror. In a way, they also thought it was this sort of mirroring, but it wasn't the kind of mirroring we're talking about here, spatial relations. It was a different
for
sense.
Wittgenstein, it was a logical mirror.
For Wittgenstein, it was logical mirroring. So the point here is that, yes, in the end of the day, the interpretation of names is governed by, constrained by, but also governed, and helpfully so, by the myriotopological organization. And that...
But that, yeah, and you can, just to make sure I get you two right, but you conceive of that, though, as there's still directly referring terms. So it's not an indirectly referring expression. It's not like a description that actually refers by describing. It's not, it doesn't do that.
Can I actually?
Sorry.
No, because you replied for your own paper, and I'll say afterwards what we said.
I think so. The quick answer, maybe Roberto wants to say something, but my quick answer to your last question is, I haven't decided yet. I think in a way, I can think of it as just direct reference, and the constraints on direct reference are just constraints that maybe also in some, or to some extent, arise when it comes to naming tables and people and tornadoes, right?
Yeah,
so external. Or perhaps no, maybe in the end of the day there is something descriptive. I still have to decide. But I think as it stands, it could be thought of as still direct reference, but governed from the outside. John.
I was just going to say that, as far as I'm concerned, I think a two-dimensional analysis of reference would be wonderful here. So you have one reference fixing mechanism for subjects, and they're probably going to be using all kinds of complicated things like the title of the map, plus the coordinate system, plus mereological relations, a conception of aggregative reference, as you know that the referent of the aggregates of the bits of the map is the aggregate of the reference, and so forth. That can all be underpinned by the fact that yes, indeed, they're constants. But the way you fix the reference can be a distinct mechanism. So I think I'd be happy with a picture like that, because I would want to distinguish the two questions, the question of meaning and interpretation on one hand, from the question of reference and truth on the other. So ultimately, in the end, the map is going to have reference, it's going to have truth, but that's one thing, and that's what you're doing when you're assigning semantic values like reference and truth. But it's another story has to be told about how subjects are capable of using the maps. I think that's important to remember when, if you think of the thing we discussed earlier, which is that you can have a computer file with all the data on the map, but it's not very usable for us. But we can use it in some visual form, for example, because that's what allows us to assign properties to locations in a way that we couldn't do if we had the information in the way it is on the binary file. So that seems to sort of force apart the two things. On the one hand, reference and truth, on the other, interpretation. That's how I would reply to your question.
Right. That's helpful. I see. So, I can keep talking now.
Well, let's say we have maybe 4 more minutes before we close the meeting, and before we take the group picture of the Iconicity group. It's a unique occasion to have a picture taken, although someone is left, but we have the equipment. So, if any of you has something like a final word to say, Achille this morning invited us to make rather me, but us to make a sort of meta final comment. But for myself, I have 4 pages of notes, and I'm happy to spend some time on those later on, not now. So I have no particular final announcement to make. I don't know if you have one.
Well, we had a question here for Group 1. John, you didn't read our question.
No, I thought we kind of should have asked it while they were presenting.
But maps have degrees of accuracy. Does it mean that we can also put it in terms of degrees of truth?
It would be an objection to the idea that the dimension of evaluation is truth. Because if truth doesn't admit degrees, then accuracy would be more.
Do you folks have a theory that would tell you whether that works? I mean, because I find this partly terminological. So if there's a big problem somewhere and someone finds it, I'm going to worry about it. But I feel like, and Camp as well, she's sort of perfectly happy to say, I don't know what's wrong with talking about degrees of truth. And it might, if a representation says a lot of things, right? It's going to make sense to talk about accuracy by saying how many of the things it says are true, right? Okay. So you get a notion of you can get a notion of accuracy if you have a representation that says lots of things, and I think these representations say lots of things in every sense of the word. They express a big proposition that looks like a big conjunction of lots of propositions, right? So I think there's room for talking about accuracy and truth in both of these things. But that's because I have a notion of the parts of these representations that lets me say they say this and they say that and they say that and they say that and they say that. What do you guys think is at stake in this worry about accuracy and truth? Because Crane says this. He's like big into saying, oh, they're not true or
In fact,
false.
we discussed Crane, that's what the origin of the...
Right.
Yeah.
But did you find Crane compelling on this? I just didn't know what he was saying about it. I was a little surprised that he seemed to be just echoing old British things about speaking like this is obvious, this is what we say in Cambridge kind of stuff. That's how we do it, yes. Right.
I guess some people would be inclined to say that perception is not a valuable for truth, but for accuracy. And to the extent that pictures really do seem to explore perception very heavily, maybe one would think that the dimension under which they're valuable is accuracy and not truth.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we kind of agreed when we were talking that maps seem to be truth evaluable.
But
maybe there's a difference between representations that exploit spatial reasoning and perception and actual perception itself. I don't know, maybe that's what explains it.
But I think some people, including Crete, probably tie the notion of truth to the possibility of having external and internal negation, for instance.
Yeah.
So I don't remember the paper that you mentioned very clearly, but at some point he says something like you can't have a picture representing the fact that something is not F, for instance.
Well, you may not be having.
Yes. So you can't actually. I don't.
Yeah, I
something
think
like
generally he says you can't represent any connectives.
Exactly.
The pictures can't represent any connectives, and he sort of he sort of says something similar to what we say in what we wonder about in the third point, which I think, which is that of course you can give sort of descriptions of the content which themselves are propositional, but that doesn't mean that the picture itself is.
But actually, maybe it's false for maps, because if the absence intuition is right, that you might actually make maps represent the fact that something is not a forest, for instance, no? Can't you?
Yeah, the absence intuition is the equivalence between external and internal negation, effectively.
Exactly, yeah.
So, insofar as the map doesn't represent that P,
It
the
represents
map
not
represents
yeah.
that not P.
Yeah, that's interesting. So
You might say it represents, or you say it represents something else as being a case of
yeah, which is
That's your, alternatively you put it that way. But I say the official absence intuition.
Oh yeah, you
just as that.
folks in Rescrolla, it's sort of like.
I was just discussing the official, but I agree with your alternative way. I like your alternative way of putting it. Yes, but the first sense, the official Rescrolla characterization, is the one that I think justifies the claim that maps aren't just statements, but they're like theories. And when you work with theories, for example, when you're proving a completeness theorem and you have to build your Hanke model and you make it maximally consistent, that's the feature of it. If P, which is indeed in the model, is not a member of it, then not P is. That's exactly the point. But I like, as your alternative description this morning, I like it even better because I'm not personally a big fan of absence talk. I don't like absences.
Right.
In spite of.
You like holes.
You might, holes are present.
Okay.
They're present. They may be described indirectly as the absence of something else, but they are there. So they're not absences. So I like the idea that what we describe as an absence of blue really is, say, the presence of red. And so I like that move. I like.
I agree. I mean, of course, I mean, in philosophy of perception, you have these Sartrean claims that you can see the absence of Pierre in his favorite cafe. The absence of Pierre is salient.
Maps, is it possible that you can see? Is it possible that the map is a sort of picture of the whole domain of reference, and that's why it literally withdraws the predicate from anything it doesn't, from any referent which it does not predicate at all? Huh? Because it's not like language in that sense that if the whole domain of reference is present, because all the regions are. Is it possible that's is it in that sense that it's like a theorem?
Yeah, because you are saying everything. You're not just making one statement about the world. You're making every possible statement about that. Is where the limited portion of the world, and in fact, not only the limited, but titled. This is where the business of titles is relevant too.
That's a good point, I suggest, for closing our workshop. Thank you very much for everyone for your dedication and willingness to submit yourself to this engaging rhythm.